Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Astrid Edwards, and I am your moderator for the event with Bonnie Garmus tonight. We are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I note that this land was never and can never be ceded. Thank you for being here for Bonnie's first Melbourne event. Now, as I'm sure you all know, the success of Bonnie Garmus and Lessons in Chemistry is long and way too long to read here, but I'm going to remind you of the highlights. Lessons in Chemistry and Bonnie have been on the New York Times and Sunday Times bestseller lists for 2 years. Lessons in Chemistry has sold about 7 million copies, and it has been published in 42 different languages. Now, all of that is a very big deal. A little bit of housekeeping before we welcome Bonnie. If you have your phone, please put it on silent, but do not put it away. Bonnie will be taking Bonnie will not be taking lessons. Bonnie will be taking questions from the audience, and that will go through the Slido app. You will see a URL or a little QR code at various points throughout the session. So if you want to ask Bonnie a question, please do. At the end, hopefully you will be able to see this very special edition of Lessons in Chemistry to my left, to your right. It is a copy of Lessons in Chemistry that is only available at Bonnie's events, and they have been signed. Readings will be selling them in a line with Bonnie at the end of the event. Finally, thanks to RMIT Culture and the Wheeler Centre for bringing us all here together tonight. It is a great pleasure to be in a city with organizations that are so supportive of readers like you and writers like Bonnie Garmus. Bonnie, welcome to the stage. Hello. Thank you so much for being here, Bonnie. I suspect if we were to ask people in the audience if they had ever experienced sexism at work, almost everybody would put their hand up. I would certainly put my hand up. How did you know such an unpleasant topic was going to be so popular?
Well, sexism is very popular, of course. Women really love it, and it just doesn't seem to be going away. I should say, women can be very sexist too. So it is a dual gender problem, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to write a book about sexism, because I have a character in the book, Miss Frask, who's a woman sexist, and she does not help her fellow women until she learns the hard way that she should have.
So Bonnie, you've had a career. You have published this amazing novel that has brought out so many people tonight to Melbourne. Did anyone ever tell you not to do it or ask you why?
No one ever told me not to do it. Basically what they said is, we're not interested. I'd written another book before, Lessons in Chemistry, and I couldn't get anyone to read it, only because it's a really small book. It was only 700 pages long. And it turns out that number to an agent, it's like this red flag, and you're forever marked for having written a 700-page novel as a debut author. So if anyone's writing a novel, that is the tip. Don't go over 385.
Lessons in Chemistry is set in the late 50s and the 60s. That is before your experience. But how did you go about doing the research to bring the world of Elizabeth Zott to life?
Well, I was a little kid then. I was about 3. I don't remember a lot about that time. But as I was writing the book, I suddenly realized that this was my mother's era, which is horrible to realize as you're writing a book, oh yeah, wait, this is my mom's generation. And when I did research on that generation, I reread The Feminine Mystique. And I was really shocked to discover that that was one of the most depressing times for American women in the entire history of America. And it was because they had been relegated to the home, and that was all they could aspire to. And so a lot of women who had higher education degrees were not allowed to do anything with them. I read that book, I read a couple of other books, and I talked to some of my mom's friends. My mom passed away, but I talked to some of her friends about that era. And one thing I have in my memory banks from that era, besides the fact that every mother had 1,000 children, and they used to shout out the back door, "Tell so-and-so to come home." My mom used to ring a bell, and then some of the other kids will say, "Your bell's ringing, I heard it 3 blocks away." So these women, all they did was, and this is all day, cook and clean and herd us around, and they were never recognized as productive and important members of their society. And that really struck me as I got older, because I had been one of those people who didn't think what they did was that important. And I was really ashamed of it when I was writing the book. So yeah, all of that came together for me when I was writing it.
What do you mean you were really ashamed of it as you were writing?
Well, because my mother had been a nurse, and she used to talk all the time about how much she loved being a nurse. It was really obvious that it made her feel important and productive. She got a salary, all of that. And there were 4 of us, and we go, "Mom's talking about nursing again, nursing." And then as I got older, and we'd all grown up, my mother put her money where her mouth was, and she returned to nursing school in her 50s. And I remember she called me, and she said, "I'm the only one there who's 50 in this group of 19-year-olds. She renewed her nursing license, and within a year, she won Nurse of the Year at her huge hospital." So I was really proud of my mom. She was really something.
This is kind of an impossible question to answer, but I'm going to try anyway, Bonnie. If she had had the chance to see your success now and to read Lessons in Chemistry, have you thought what she might think of it?
She would be very unhappy about the swearing. When we were kids, we were not allowed to swear. And if we did swear, we had to put a quarter in a jar. And the jar was stuffed with quarters. We were a family of 4 girls who swore all the time, and it used to just drive my mother nuts. And then one day, we all realized that if we just simply emptied the jar now and again, we could go out and buy ice cream and stuff, and then later replace the quarters. Isn't that terrible? I mean, we were horrible. But yeah, she would not like that, and my mother was quite religious. She would not like the fact that Elizabeth Zott was an atheist. But other than that, I think she'd be really happy with it.
I like to hear that. Now, I opened this session with quite a flippant question about, how did you make sexism popular? But, you've spoken before that, you have experienced sexism. Most of us here have. I'd like to talk to you about why that is important to see in literature, why it was important, to write about and to expose.
Well, I think, for me, the book started with a bad day at work I had had. I think that day at work, I'd been in a meeting and it was just terrible. I'd been presenting ideas. I've done this was my career. I was a copywriter and a creative director, and I was presenting ideas for the billionth time for a very important and large campaign for a major technology company in the Bay Area. And that day, after I presented all my ideas, and by the way, I was the only woman in the room that day, as I had been the only woman in the room for about 10 or 12 years. And that day when I presented my ideas, no one commented on it. I got no feedback whatsoever. And there was one man I didn't know in the room that day, and he actually was very dismissive of me, and he said, "We're not going to do that. I have my own ideas." And then he read my own PowerPoint slide out loud, and he pretended that those were his ideas, and everybody in that room told him he was brilliant. And I was stunned. And as I was sitting there, I thought actually I was on candid camera or something. I thought, they're playing a joke on me, but it wasn't a joke. And so I was talked over, I was dismissed. And as I was leaving the meeting that day, one of the men said to me, you have something due at 5, so you better get on that. And after he said that, I didn't just walk back to my desk. I stomped back to my desk and I thought, how many other women in the world have had a day like this? How many women in the world have had this day today that I'm having? And how much longer are we gonna continue to have this day? And so, thank you. When I got back to my desk, instead of writing that thing that was due at 5, I wrote the first chapter of Lessons in Chemistry.
That is the perfect response. I am very glad that you did. You've mentioned that you wrote a novel before, nobody wanted it. How did Lessons in Chemistry come to be? How did you basically get it published for so many people to fall in love with?
I have no idea. Honestly, when my agent signed me before the book was finished, which is really unheard of. I was shocked when she did it. In fact, I cautioned her against it. And she goes, oh, you're full of confidence. But no, she actually said, I never signed somebody without the book being done. And when I first met her, she told me that. She said, she'd read 2,000 words, and she said, I'd like to see more of this. And she's at a big agency in London. And then she said, when are you going to be done with this book? At that point, I'd written most of it. We were living abroad. I'd written most of it in Switzerland. And I just moved to London. And so I was working still full time, but remotely. And I said, oh, I'll have this done in June. I had no idea if I could have it done in June. But I lied, and I said, I'll have it done in June. And then in April, she called me into her office. My agent is Felicity Blunt. Blunt is the perfect last name for Felicity. And she's just the greatest agent. I'm very lucky to be represented by her. But she called me into her office, and she was very friendly, and she talked about the book, and she said, so again, when are you going to be finished? And I said, well, it's June. She goes, I said June. She said, well, it's April. Like, aren't you done now? And anyway, she said, you know what? I'm just going to sign you. I was shocked because I don't know how that happened. All I can tell you is that she said to me during this meeting, we were talking about various things, and she said something about how her husband was an actor. And I said, oh, really? Would he have been in anything I would have seen? My agent is married to Stanley Tucci. It was horrifying. She just looked at me like, I've got a live one here. And I don't do research on people, so I even struggled to realize that I actually almost said to her, you look a lot like Emily Blunt. Anyway, the meeting went great. She signed me that day, and I was so excited that I was walking back to the tube. I kept fiddling with my phone in my pocket, and I accidentally dialed emergency services. And I heard this voice saying, is there an emergency? Hello? And I picked up and I said, oh, I'm sorry, hi. And they said, is there a problem? And I said, no, there's no problem, I got an agent. And she asked me not to call back again. I think I called 3 times.
That is a wonderful origin story for Lessons in Chemistry. I would like to ask you about 6:30. There is a murmur from the audience. I assume that everybody, or many people, like 6:30. I confess 6:30 is one of my favorite characters, but also aspects of the book. In that initial meeting with your agent, were there any discussions about having a point of view character that is a canine?
She didn't know about it at that point. It was a surprise to her. It was not a pleasant surprise to her. She had still only read 2,000 words. She's really great. She goes, look, I don't want to read any more until you're done. And then I was done, and she called me up and she said, let's talk about the dog. But you got to get feedback from people. You've got to listen to someone like her. I certainly do. But we did have quite a few arguments about that dog. And I think I finally said, look, it isn't magical realism. In fact, all animals have brains. They process information. They make decisions. We tend to measure intelligence only by human terms, and that is a huge and catastrophic mistake. And so I said, I'm keeping the dog.
6:30 is wonderful. In Lessons in Chemistry, you are doing many things, but one of those things is making a comment on the times, making a comment on the structures of society, and having, a point of view character that is not human, that is not part of human society. What did that let you do, I guess, and help us experience that you couldn't have done with another, kid in the novel or something?
Well, part of the reason I wanted to have that dog, and I consider 6:30 the anthropologist of the novel, we never hear the other side of the animal kingdom comment on us. We comment on them. I always like to point out to people when they say, my dog doesn't know any words, I always say, how many dog words do you speak? We tend not to learn their languages, but we insist that they learn ours. And I think that means that they might have a higher intellect than we do. I don't know. The octopus has 9 brains, and I'm trying to get it to run for president of the United States.
I hope you are successful in that, Bonnie.
Yeah.
I've asked you about 6:30, but obviously I should ask you also about Elizabeth herself. Elizabeth is a representation of so many things. Elizabeth existed before, I was born, but I feel so much of Elizabeth. And I'm also aware that Elizabeth was quite depressed or unhappy at various points in her life. And I'd like to ask you about, again, telling the story of, not being happy, of depression, and what that means, particularly in a central character, in what is a joyous book in many ways.
Well, Elizabeth Zott to me was quite real. When I was writing her, I felt like I was writing my role model. I really wanted to write a character who would say exactly what I meant to say in a meeting, but only thought of 3 hours later. When you're a writer, you can just go, I know what she's going to say. And then she can say it on the page. But for me, I thought it was really important to develop a character like that, who was determined to live life on her terms and through the logical lens of science. Because certainly science and scientists know that gender politics is completely irrational. It's a huge imbalance in our society, and it's a societal construct. We made that. It isn't natural. So I think sexism is an indication of an imbalance, just like climate change is an indication of imbalance. And when I was writing the book, the theme of balance became the guiding principle behind the book. So in the book, there is dark and light. She is really depressed. She goes through horrible things. But there's also a lot of light in life, and I wanted to bring that out. But also, chemistry is the science of balance. You cannot have an unbalanced chemical equation. It's not possible. And rowing, and I know one of my most favorite rowers is in the audience tonight. Rowing is the sport of balance, and if you row with my friend Nick, you might do the other sport called swimming, because you get kicked out of your boat. But it's a really important thing in rowing. You may be in an 8 with all people that you don't even like, but in rowing, you cooperate with your teammates. You have one goal, you set that goal, and you perform together. Whether or not, your opinions of people in that boat don't matter. What matters is deciding what we're going to do together to accomplish. So my new idea for the Senate, I'm going to keep talking about American politics, is that we put all of our Congress people in 8s and see what happens.
I do not think they would stay in that boat very long. So you've mentioned rowing, and obviously rowing is a pursuit that Elizabeth and Calvin do together. Calvin has done for many years. It struck me that many of Elizabeth's pursuits and outlook on life was very egalitarian. Rowing where everybody is equal. Teaching herself in a library where everybody is welcome. And I guess that led me to wonder, what would Elizabeth think of feminism as we understand it now in 2024? What do you think she'd think? She
would be pissed that we're still not where we should be. I think Somebody asked me what the statistics for women in STEM are, and it's something like 28%, and yay. But we're 50% of the planet, and 28% is not good, because the fact is that STEM jobs are among the most lucrative in the world. And for women to not be on equal ground there means that they will always be behind economically. And that's not good either. The other big part of this equation is that a woman's brain isn't actually that much different from a man's. And in fact, we have certain strengths that men don't have, and men have certain strengths that we don't have. But none of this involves thinking. And so there's been this sort of a long-term thought about women being the weaker sex. The reason why I put Elizabeth Zott, the reason why I made her a scientist and I put her in a lab was because science knows better. Science has always known that women aren't weak. And so for her to be in a lab and to have the, basically scientists treat her as if she's weak, tells you that there are some scientists who really shouldn't get to wear that badge of science. I feel very strongly about that, and I hear from women scientists all over the world all the time, and men as well, who want this to end. In terms of what Elizabeth Zott would think of feminism now, she'd be like, stand up, speak out, let's stomp this out once and for all, and let's move on. We have a lot of problems to solve. We can't go, well, she's a woman. I don't think she can do it. She can do it.
Elizabeth's academic career is derailed because in the lab, she experiences violence. As everybody in this room knows, Australia is experiencing a pandemic of violence against women. And Bonnie, you don't need to know anything about Australia, but you do understand the situation of women around the world over time. I wanted to explore with you why it was important to include the experience of Elizabeth, but also the experience of several other prominent female characters in the novel.
Well, in terms of the sexual abuse and harassment and, the assaults in the book, we would all like to think that this isn't commonplace. It's incredibly commonplace. In the United States, 1 out of 5 women will be sexually assaulted in their lifetimes. When I said this to a UK audience, they went, ooh. And then to that audience, I said, in the UK, it's 1 in 4. And the room just froze. And I think the reason why people sometimes don't realize how bad it still is because for a woman to report a sexual assault is still very difficult. Either she is not believed, or she feels ashamed, or she knows that if she does report it, nothing will happen. And I had a best friend a long time ago she was the head, if you can believe this is her job description. She was the head rape nurse at San Francisco General. And I went to pick her up one night from work, and she wasn't where she said she would be. And so even though I wasn't supposed to do this, I wandered up to her floor. And I'll never forget that night, because it wasn't like a Saturday night or anything. It was just a typical Tuesday night or something. And there were these folding chairs out in the hallway. And it was lined with women who had been sexually assaulted that night. One of them was 12 years old. They were in various states of disarray. Some had been beaten. Some were just sitting there in shock. Some were crying. Some were, it seemed like some of them were catatonic. My friend did all the rape kits for all of those women. And then later we found out in the United States that all of those rape kits for years and years were thrown away, and they were never processed. So none of the rapists were brought to justice. And the reason why they said they couldn't process the rape kits is because they didn't have enough personnel. And so women were been dismissed like that. Your statistics are also, these are things that need to come out. We're living in a world of assault and violence that is completely unnecessary, but we're not sure why. Why is it against women? To this day, I don't quite understand that.
Thank you, Bonnie. Do you get different responses I mean, this has been translated into 42 different languages. Do you get different responses to this part of the story, in different nations or cultures?
No, it's universal. I was lucky enough, I went to Dubai to the literary festival there, and while I was there, this large group of women in burqas approached me, and they were like, and I was like, me? And they asked me to come sit with them in a private room, and so that we could just talk freely. And so we found a room, and they were incredible women. And they told me about their lives. They were really funny. Like, they told me they loved burqas because you can eat whatever you want and no one can tell if you've gained weight. And they wanted to talk about women's rights. They wanted to find out, because they couldn't get information, what was the rest of the world doing about women's rights. And they talked about what their days were like and what their lives were like. And it was a fascinating conversation. But the one thing I remember was I was saying, well, in the United States, they've just rolled back Roe versus Wade. Women no longer have the right to an abortion. It's really tragic. We're pretty afraid of this. And they said, oh, yeah, it's tough for women in the United States. They were so funny. But they told me a lot of things that I really treasured. They told me that they have underground networks. They told me what they're doing to educate their daughters. These women are organized. And when I see a woman in a burqa, I think, you go, girl. I was really astonished by what they had to say and what they were doing about it.
I'd like to move away from the slightly depressing topic of violence and go to an element of the story that I was very surprised by and utterly adored. And it is this idea of, chosen family. Mm-hmm. And found family. There are very few, relationships that would reflect the time, the traditional nuclear family that's happy and functioning in the 1960s, but so many incredibly strong, lifelong bonds. Why was that important to you?
Well, I think a lot of people are born into families. They may not feel like they belong to that family. And I know I've seen that with my own family. My children are adopted, so they definitely weren't born into my family. But I think the idea, one of my kids is gay, and when she was in college, we went to visit, and a lot of her friends were either gay or transgender or whatever. And we really got to, through her, know this community really well. And the stories of these kids, we offered to take a few kids out for dinner, and we took 24. We were like, I guess we're getting pizza. But it was really interesting because uniformly they were all really wonderful people, but a lot of them had been disowned by their families, either for being gay or transgender or whatever it was, or for just being gender fluid. They came from, much more conservative families. But the sorrow in their voices had stuck with me for a long time. And so I wanted to write, Elizabeth Zott has a terrible upbringing. Her partner, Calvin, also has a terrible upbringing. This happens to a lot of people. And I wanted to make sure that readers knew that if you don't feel like you belong in your family, don't worry. The world is your family. You will find your people, and they're out there. And I certainly feel that way with my group of friends and with my own family that is, definitely not biological. Family can be defined in a lot of great ways that have nothing to do with biology.
You explore this. You explore this idea so beautifully through Madeline, Elizabeth and Calvin's daughter, and also her family tree, the terribly failed school assessment that she does very well in terms of life, but terribly in terms of the idea of her, the perspective of what the school wants. But it also opens up questions of parenting and what is good parenting and kind of parenting outside the home by other adults, and it takes a village to raise a child. Again, that was very much like against the kind of norm of the day, but can be so beautiful now. And I wanted to kind of again come back to what you were doing with this narrative and what you were asking us all to think about in terms of parenting.
I was just in an event where someone said, "Are you a free-range parenter?" And I felt like a chicken. Am I free-range? It was the very first time I'd heard that applied to parenting, so I'm really behind the times. But when my kids were young, I relied on a lot of people to help. We couldn't have done that without a neighborhood supporting. All of our families were supporting each other, picking each other's kids up from school and working together because all of us were working parents. And I think, it's really important to have relationships with people and realize you don't raise a child just in a vacuum, it's just you. The child has to go out in the world. So that was really important to me to include that. And my own kids, one of them was a little bit wild, and she was really wild. And she used to go out in the backyard, in the front yard, and our neighbor's house overlooked our yard. And she used to go out and play with matches. And she used to light things on fire all the time. And my neighbor she was just hysterical about this. She hated it. And she'd call me up and she'd say, "Sophie is outside lighting vegetables on fire." And I'd say, "Yeah, I know. If she gets burned, she'll learn." So apparently that is free-range parenting.
What do your kids think of lessons in chemistry?
Well, they're the greatest. Honestly, I have the greatest kids. I'm very lucky, but I'm their mom. They're like, "Oh, Mom wrote a book, whatever." Because I've been a writer for a long time. But I think they didn't realize quite how many people had read it, and they saw something where I was called. I had to do this event. Believe it or not, they dressed me for this event in Ferragamo, and my jacket cost 15,000 pounds. And by the way, I didn't get to keep any of it. But the trousers were so uncomfortable that you couldn't sit down in them, and I had to. And there were all these models there that night, and they go, "You don't sit in Ferragamo." And I went, "Who makes these clothes?" But anyway, I digress, because what happened was that night they took all these pictures, they had hair and makeup, and they made us all look better than we actually are. And that night they coined this phrase, global phenomenon. And my kids, without telling me, on their phones, it no longer says mom, it says global phenomenon.
Bonnie, I have had a look at the little iPad in front of me, and I have never seen so many questions come through for an author on stage. So I am going to ask a few from the audience. What do you think, this is a good one, what do you think about the categorization of books as women's fiction?
I'm not in favor of that. I've worked really hard to promote this book to men because, frankly, I have now quite a substantial readership in men, but men are the ones who need to read it. And I'm really pleased to tell you that the book has been adopted into a lot of universities and high schools and things like that, but in London, into boys' schools. And I hear from 15-year-old boys every day of the week. And I heard from my favorite one that I ever heard from. I think they made the kids write me, but this kid wrote me the most hilarious thing. He goes, "Dear Bonnie Garmus, thank you for writing Lessons in Chemistry. It was way better than Lord of the Flies."
That is good on so many levels. This is another one from the audience, and it's a little bit related. Do you have a suggestion, or how would you encourage more women into STEM? And perhaps you've just answered it by saying, educate the boys.
Partly educate the boys. These 15-year-old boys, people ask me if I worry about future generations. I'm not worried about this generation. These guys seem, I keep talking to young people all over the world, and first of all, they seem to be readers. But I have heard from so many young men. Okay, I got this DM the other day from a young guy who said, I bought my girlfriend Lessons in Chemistry for her birthday, and I wondered if you could just take a look at what I've written in the book before I give it to her, just to tell me if it's good. And it was amazing. You know, he said, dear so-and-so, you're so much smarter than me, you're wonderful, I think you're great, but I love you for your mind, and all of this stuff. And I said, this is incredible. And he goes, thanks, well, I did Google something you said, and then I sort of, it's the funniest thing. But I love that. I want to say, it's so many young people. Women are in STEM. What happens is, in fact, there are more women STEM majors out there than there are male STEM people. But what happens is when they get into the job market, they find often an environment that is unwelcoming to women. And so there's a study out that shows that a lot of people think, well, women drop out because they go home and they have babies. That turns out not to be true. Just as many men quit their jobs during your ages between 25 and 35 as women. But for women, they always say it's because you went off to have a baby.
We can't actually see very well everybody in the audience, but if we were to better see people, I suspect, I don't know, many would be female here. Bonnie, oh, hello.
There you are.
Do you get different responses between the genders to lessening chemistry? But also, I mean, you were talking about the young man who slid into your DMs. Do you get different responses in terms of age as well?
You know, it's really, when I was writing the book, one of my goals was to write universal characters. It doesn't matter what age you are, all of us have Elizabeth Zott inside of us. All of us have faced these unfairnesses at work. Plenty of men have faced tons of unfairness at work. It might be slightly different from what a woman faces, but they do too. And I think, if we can all acknowledge that we have this common experience and work together to end it, it would be really helpful. But honestly, I think the 15-year-old boys are like, I got another DM from another 15-year-old boy who said, I had to tell my father to stop talking to my mother that way. Yeah. So I'm feeling good about this future generation, and I do think though that we have to just keep working on it.
You are doing part of that work with Lessons in Chemistry. Here is another question from Anonymous in the audience, from someone out there. Bonnie, why do you think that Lessons in Chemistry is so successful? And I'm going to add to the question here, successful commercially, but also, I mean, it's not every Tuesday night in Melbourne that this many people come out to see a writer. They've come for you. Why, do you think?
Thank you for coming, by the way. I really deeply appreciate it. Honestly, I'm not always sure. I should tell you that before the book was published, my agent, who I love, even though I didn't know who her husband was or her sister was or anything, she said to me the night before she was going to take the book to Frankfurt, which is where they take books to see if publishers will be interested in publishing them. She called me and she said, look, I've taken lots of books to Frankfurt. You may not get a single bite. You have to be prepared for that. This book is really quirky, and I just don't know how well this is going to do. And she said, how do you feel? And I said, I was rejected 98 times in my other novel. I'm ready. I'm ready for rejection. And so we went into battle, and she called me 24 hours later, and she said, I don't think this has ever happened to me, but we've had 17 offers. We were hoping for one. And so she and I have discussed this ad nauseum. I think one of the other themes of the book is commonality. We are all related. We are all related. We all came from stars. We all came from one African woman. And I think it's our commonality that we sometimes forget about, even though we are 99.9% the same. That's something I think we should be celebrating and supporting each other on around the world, instead of always being so, we're always at battle. And so that was one of the points of the book I really wanted to bring out, that scientifically and logically, we are actually, the reason why we feel strongly about Elizabeth Zott is because all of us have Elizabeth Zott inside of us. All of us have been ignored or faced injustice or lost someone they loved. All of us go through all of these emotions. I think that's the answer, but really have no idea.
Thank you. We have a question from Penny. I really like this question, Penny. I'm sorry, I have lost this question.
Sorry, Penny.
I have lost the question. I'm sorry, everybody. A question from Anonymous. And I did come up with this in my research as well. There's a lot on the internet talking about Elizabeth as autistic. And I guess your responses to that.
Yeah, actually, it's one of my most favorite questions. I did not write Elizabeth Zott as an autistic adult. I wrote her as a Stoic. And this is Stoicism as defined by Marcus Aurelius. And I love the fact that people find her to be on the spectrum. They also find Calvin to be on the spectrum, when the qualities in both of these people are qualities of Stoicism. We often hear talk about people on the spectrum like they're weird or they're different. They're not weird or they're different. You know, they're really not. I think we know now there are 5 or 6 different types of brains. And when we talk about neurodiversity, that also includes your own brain, whether you're on the spectrum or not. That's what diversity means. And diversity is what makes the world go round in every aspect of life. So for me, when someone says, I think Elizabeth is on the spectrum, I say, yeah, she's a Stoic. A Stoic is somebody who speaks with logic, tries not to get angry despite the circumstances, and lives her life in a way that is meaningful to her. She's kind to people, or tries to be, but she seeks truth. She does not seek likability, she seeks truth.
Thank you. Obviously, you've achieved, commercial success in this story that you have led us all into. But I'm wondering about your personal experience, with that success. Do people treat you differently now? I mean, can you walk into a publishing house and get your first novel that was rejected all of those many times published?
I am so glad you asked that question. Now, I know this will really bug my agents, but no one's asked to read it, except finally my US agent asked me if she could read it. This is after 2 years. I was like, you really aren't interested still? But now I'm being really mean, and I've said, you can't read it. I know, I'm so petulant. It's only because I've taken a few of the ideas from that novel, and I'm incorporating them in a new novel. It's basically new, but I really liked a couple of the themes that I did not want to have go away. So, but no, I mean, the only way I get treated differently, I was on an airplane the other day, and this is how much I travel. When the steward comes up and goes, hi again. Yeah, hi.
That is too many planes.
Yeah, there's too many planes.
We have a question from Fiona. This is a really good question. Hi, Bonnie. I'm a 60-year-old writer writing my first novel. Do you have any advice for a beginner writer who is now in her 7th decade?
Yes. First of all, yay for you. Second of all, it turns out we're finding, if you have experience and you put it in a book, your book will be richer for it. There's a lot of ageism, racism, all sorts of sexism in the world. All the isms are usually bad. Ageism is a really dumb one, though, because with it you dismiss the experience that all these people have gathered. They've been through the mill. They know what the story is. So I tell everybody, and this is really true, publishers don't care how old you are. Only the media cares. But publishers do not care. All they care is that you've written a story and they like the craft. And in terms of writing advice, I only have one piece of advice, and that is to write with confidence. Don't worry about what people are going to think. Write with your own voice. Don't imitate anyone else because it will not turn out well. But write with confidence and write the story you want to read, and you will come up with something. And if you're in your 70s, you have so much more to draw on than somebody in their 20s. I know some pretty good 20-year-old writers now. They make me sick, but they're going to get better and better. So yeah, 70, good age to start writing.
That sounds like good life advice, not just writing advice. I'm so happy to be here, Bonnie.
Oh, I'm so happy you're the moderator. I can't tell you.
We've just met tonight, and I've asked you about sexism, I've asked you about feminism, I've asked you, about violence in the chemistry lab. You've been talking to people all around the world about these things, and I'm, wondering, do you feel drawn into activism or a responsibility to talk about these things beyond being a writer and talking about the book? How do you navigate that kind of public persona that comes with being an international writer?
I'm going to tell my kids you called me an international writer.
You are an international writer.
No, it's great. I do talk a lot about feminism and activism. I do talk a lot, especially to young women, what can you do now? What can all of us do now? I can tell you for the men in the audience, what we want are male allies. I've had the benefit of having male allies in my life, in my career. They really helped take me out of the gutter and raised me and made me see things in different ways. I've been really lucky that way. I've had terrible sexism at work, but I have had, I'd say, 3 male allies in my life who have always kept an eye on me. And I really appreciate that. It has made all the difference to my career. Without them, I don't know where I'd be. But there are women who don't have that. And so I say, to the men in the audience, if you're sitting in a meeting and a woman's getting talked over, please interrupt and just say, she was still talking. That makes a huge difference. You're saying, I'm not going to put up with this. And for anyone who has a daughter out there, when you don't say something, then you're leaving that legacy for your daughter. She will endure that. She will face that when she's in her 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and onward. So men can really make a difference, a huge impact in this. And it benefits you because women have excellent ideas, just like men do. And we have a lot of problems to solve. And the more people we have on it, the better. Not the less people, the more people. So that's what I'd say. But for women, speak up. Don't be afraid. I know it's really easy to be afraid, but don't be afraid. And when a woman speaks up in the meeting, another woman says, let her speak. Support each other at work. It really works. It really does work.
So well said. Another question from the audience. Given that sexism is still so alive in 2024, you could have set this story now. Why taking us back to the 50s and 60s?
Well, that day in the meeting, I was so mad. When I said it then because I wanted reassurance for myself that we had moved ahead as women in the world. Because that day, I thought we have not moved forward at all, and I was furious. And so I started doing the research, and we have moved forward. For instance, we have credit cards now. No, in my mother's generation, she could not work. A woman could not work if she was pregnant. Women got fired from their jobs for being pregnant. My own mother hid her pregnancy with my older sister for 4 months and was fired because of it. So it's a really big deal that we've moved past those things. Back when my mom was living, or when she was young, women weren't allowed to have their names on the deed of the house. They had no legal right to their husband's salary. So if their husband left them, they could be destitute. So there was no parity whatsoever, and we have more of that. But in the United States, as I said earlier, they've overturned Roe versus Wade, a woman's basic right to an abortion. That's really not right. What a child does to a woman's body is pretty horrific when you think about it. I know women in the audience will go, yeah, I know. But not to have a choice, because invariably the woman will have to raise that child alone a lot of the time, and she's stuck with a financial burden, and she has to work, and she has to do everything. So there's never been parity in that area. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I think it's extremely important, that I had to set it then so that I could reassure myself we'd move forward. And I got to tell you, I was really disappointed because we haven't moved forward, not nearly enough, not nearly enough.
I wish you were running for president.
We're doing an ad campaign.
Oh, are you?
In the United States, it says, Elizabeth Zott for president, 6:30 for vice president.
I love those choices. Final question.
Yeah.
Very easy one. The 700-page novel that you are taking the themes that you want to put out in the world, is it in the same world as Lessons in Chemistry, or is it a different?
It's completely different.
Completely different.
It's completely different. Yeah, I'm not writing a sequel. I might eventually write a sequel to Lessons in Chemistry because it actually got its start a long time ago in a novel that I never finished, but in that novel, Madeline Zott was the protagonist. She was 30 years old and she had a daughter. And it was told from her viewpoint, which is how I knew to write Madeline as a child because I know who she becomes as an adult. And so I always think, maybe I'll go back to that. But when I was writing it, and Elizabeth Zott, her mother, was in it for just 3 sentences. And the sentences were, she was a chemist, she had a TV show job cooking, and she hated it. And so she demanded that Lessons in Chemistry be about her. But maybe eventually I will go back to that other one because Madeline is sort of cool as an adult.
She really is. Bonnie,
Yeah.
this has been an utter pleasure. Thank you for coming to Melbourne.
Thank you.
Please thank Bonnie Garmus.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. You're wonderful. I knew it.